The smell of roasted turkey filled my house that morning. Candles flickered across the long oak table, glinting off the silverware Linda used to polish every Thanksgiving. My children were laughing in the kitchen, clinking glasses, pretending we were still a family. I smiled for them. I always do. But inside, something felt colder than the November air sneaking through the window. They say Thanksgiving is about family, about giving thanks for what we have. But this year, my family gave thanks for something I didn't even know I'd already lost. When I lifted my glass to make a toast, my eldest son David stood up. He cleared his throat, flashing that proud grin I used to love. "Actually, Dad," he said, "I've got something better than a toast." He held up a stack of papers. "From now on, this house is legally mine." The room froze. My hand trembled. "What did you just say?" David smirked. "You signed it yourself last year when you were in the hospital. Remember, I just finalized it." I could feel my heartbeat echoing louder than the ticking clock. "You took your mother's house on Thanksgiving." The glass slipped from my hand, shattering across the floor. No one moved. No one breathed. That was the moment I realized this dinner wasn't about giving thanks. It was about taking everything. But what my son didn't know was that his own daughter would uncover something buried for 10 years, something that would change everything. Would you fight your own son for your home? Stay with me, because this Thanksgiving dinner turns into Judgment Day. The night before Thanksgiving always carried a certain weight in our family. Dad, Robert Miller, 72, had spent most of the day preparing the dining room, polishing the old oak table until it gleamed under the chandelier, arranging chairs with the precision of a man who believed order held chaos at bay. The house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, but beneath that warmth hung a tension thick enough to choke on. It wasn't the food that mattered, it was the seating, the guests, and the unspoken wars waiting to surface once everyone arrived. When my sister Emily walked in, she gave me a look. "Same battlefield, different year," she whispered. She was 38, practical, always ready with a biting remark. Her dark hair was pulled tight in a bun, her coat draped carelessly over the banister. Dad overheard her and shook his head. "It's not a battlefield," he said. "It's Thanksgiving. At least let me have one day of peace." But even he didn't believe his own words. Soon my brother David showed up with his wife Melissa. David, 42, broad-shouldered, always dressed like success, was stitched into his suits, wore a smug smile as he handed Dad a bottle of wine. "From Napa," he said, "the kind real families drink on holidays." Melissa trailed behind him, fur coat brushing against her jewelry. "I hope you didn't overcook the turkey this year," she said, glancing around the dining room like an appraiser judging value. Dad's jaw tightened. "I haven't overcooked a turkey in 50 years. The words hung there. I poured myself a glass of water, hoping to dilute the rising bitterness. Emily leaned closer to me. "Watch," she said. "David's not here for turkey. He's here for blood." She wasn't wrong. As coats were piled, voices mingled, and the kids ran up the stairs. It became harder to ignore the undercurrent. Dad tried to direct traffic like always, but you could see it in the way his hand trembled slightly when he touched the back of a chair. Dinner began quietly. Plates clattered, silverware scraped. For a few minutes it seemed like maybe it could be normal. But silence never lasts in this family. David raised his glass. "To family," he said loudly, his eyes cut toward Emily. "Even when some of us think they're better than the rest." Emily slammed her fork down. "Don't start." Melissa laughed softly too, rehearsed to be genuine. "Oh, come on. If we can't joke at dinner, when can we?" Dad set his napkin on the table. "This isn't joking. This is baiting." David leaned back in his chair, smirking. "If you think I came here to play nice, Dad, you're mistaken. We need to talk about the house, about the future." The table froze. The house. That old brick house with its peeling shutters, its creaking floors, and decades of memories. It was worth a fortune in today's market, and everyone knew it. Emily spoke first. "This again, can't we at least eat before tearing into each other?" But David wouldn't stop. "I've been looking into reverse mortgage options. We could use the money now. Dad's health isn't what it used to be." The words hit like a blade. Dad straightened, his face tightening. "My health is my business, and this house is not yours to sell," Melissa chimed in, her tone sweet venom. "We're just being practical. You don't want to leave us with debt, do you? Think of the grandchildren." I caught Dad's eyes. For a split second, he looked small, almost cornered. Emily pushed her chair back. "This is disgusting. He's sitting right here." David shrugged. "Better to discuss it now than pretend it doesn't matter." The turkey sat cooling on the table untouched as the argument circled like vultures. Melissa reached across, placing her manicured hand on Dad's arm. "Robert, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You've done enough. Let us handle things." He pulled back, voice firm. "Enough. I built this family. I built this house. And you think you can just swoop in and decide?" His hand trembled again, but this time from rage. That's when I realized Emily had been right. This wasn't about dinner. This was about power. David leaned forward, his voice cold. "You're not fit to manage anymore. The sooner you accept that, the better for everyone." The chandelier hummed overhead, and I swear the air itself shifted. Emily stood. "If you think bullying him will get you what you want, think again." Melissa smirked. "It's not bullying, it's reality." I wanted to shout, to throw my glass against the wall to make them see what they were doing. Instead, my throat tightened. Dad finally stood. His chair scraped against the floor like a warning bell. "I will not be bullied in my own home." The room fell silent. Even the children stopped laughing upstairs. He looked at each of us, his voice low but steady. "When your mother died, I promised her this house would remain in the family. But not like this. Not with greed tearing us apart." His words should have ended it, but instead they lit the fuse. David's face darkened. "Then you leave us no choice," Emily gasped. "No choice. You're threatening him." Melissa's voice dripped poison. "Call it what you want. We'll get what's ours." At that moment, my heart pounded so loud I could barely hear my own breath. And maybe yours is too. Because what would you do if your own family tried to corner your father at Thanksgiving, demanding his house while the turkey went cold? Would you fight back or stay silent? Tell me in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The room was divided now, lines drawn, sides chosen. Thanksgiving had become a war zone, and the turkey was no longer the centerpiece. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I still remember the first time Linda and I saw this place. It wasn't much back then, just a patch of overgrown land at the edge of town with a half-fallen fence and an apple tree that hadn't bloomed in years. But Linda looked at it and smiled the way she did when she already saw the future. "This is it," she said, tugging my sleeve. "Can't you feel it? It already feels like home." Back then, I was a young mailman who barely made enough to cover bills. She worked part-time at the town library, always coming home with ink on her fingers and stories in her eyes. We didn't have money, but we had the kind of hope only people in love can afford. We built the house piece by piece, one paycheck, one weekend at a time. I remember hammering nails with my bare hands when the toolbox broke. Linda painted the walls herself, left a tiny handprint on the doorframe, so we'd always remember who made it ours. At night, we'd sit on the unfinished porch eating sandwiches and watching fireflies dance over the yard. The stars were brighter then, or maybe it was just us. When the first rain hit the roof we built, we stood in the doorway, laughing like fools, soaking wet because it didn't leak. That night she made me promise something I didn't think would matter so much later. "Promise me one thing, Frank," she said, her hand still wet and cold in mine. "Keep this house, no matter what. Don't let anyone turn it into just another address." I promised her, and I've kept that promise for 40 years. We raised our kids here. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper everywhere, birthdays in the backyard, the smell of Linda's pies cooling by the window, all of it stitched into these walls. Even the scratches on the floor from Sophie's father's toy trucks are still there. Time doesn't erase a home, it just hides it under layers of silence. When Linda got sick, the house changed. The walls seemed to whisper less, the light dimmed faster. She couldn't climb the stairs anymore, so we moved her bed near the window. She liked watching the mail truck pass each day, said it made her feel close to me even when I was at work. She never complained. Not once. But I saw the way she'd clutch her chest sometimes, waiting for the pain to pass, then smile at me so I wouldn't worry. One evening I came home early and found her sitting at the table writing something in her Bible. She closed it quickly when she saw me. "What are you working on?" I asked. "Just something for you to find later," she said. "Don't peek." I laughed. "You and your secrets," she winked. "Every wife needs at least one." I didn't think about it again, not until the day she was gone. The morning she passed, the sky was so still it felt wrong to move. I remember pouring her coffee like always, only to realize I'd forgotten she couldn't drink it anymore. I left the cup there for hours until the steam died. The house became quiet in a way that hurt. Every creak in the floor felt like an echo of her steps. I kept her chair by the window, her books on the shelf, even her scarf on the hook. The smell of her perfume lingered for months, soft floral like a memory that refused to fade. People told me to move on, to sell, to start over. But how do you sell something that holds your soul? Every morning I still pour 2 cups of coffee. Hers always goes cold, but it makes the morning feel less empty. Sometimes I sit in the living room listening to the wind slide through the cracks she used to complain about. I like to think it's her coming back, checking if I'm keeping my promise. The house creaks at night. The boards shift and sigh. I've lived long enough to know wood doesn't really breathe, but I swear this one does. It remembers us. I thought keeping the house was keeping her alive. Maybe that's why I never fixed the leaky faucet she hated or repainted the porch she loved. They're all pieces of her, the imperfections that made this place real. Now, when I walk these rooms alone, I can still hear her voice in the rhythm of the walls. Keep it frank, no matter what. And I have. For 40 years, through winters and loneliness, through bills and birthdays. No one came to through every sound of an empty house settling into memory. Maybe that's why the idea of losing it now, of seeing someone else's name on the deed, feels like losing her all over again. This isn't just a house, it's her heartbeat buried under the floorboards. And as long as I'm still here, it's still beating. After dinner, the plates were cleared and the house fell into that comfortable silence that comes after a meal. At least it used to be comfortable. Lucas poured himself a small glass of wine, Emma carried the leftovers to the fridge, and Sophie sat on the rug beside the fireplace brushing her doll's hair. David stood near the dining table, the brown envelope now resting in his hand like it belonged there all along. He tapped the edge of it against his palm. "Dad, can we talk about something important?" I didn't like his tone. Too formal, too polite. That kind of voice always means someone rehearsed what they're about to say. "What's that, son?" I asked. He slipped the papers out of the envelope and straightened them carefully like he was about to read a contract, not talk to his father. "These," he said, "are the official property transfer documents. The deed. I just wanted to make sure you knew everything's been finalized." I blinked. "Finalized?" He nodded. "Yeah. The house is under my name now. We started the process last year, remember?" For a second I thought it was a joke. David always had that dry sense of humor that never quite landed, but when I looked at his face there was no smile, only certainty. "What are you talking about?" I asked, standing up. He didn't flinch. "You signed the papers at the hospital. I notarized them afterward. I've just been waiting for the title to clear." The sound in my ears changed. Everything else, the crackling fire, the clock, even Sophie's quiet humming faded out until I could only hear my own pulse. "I never signed anything like that," I said. David tilted his head, his tone patient, condescending. "You were in recovery. You probably don't remember. I handled everything. It's done now." Emma turned from the fridge, her hand still holding a dish. "David, what do you mean it's done?" He shrugged. "It's not a big deal. I'm just protecting the family assets. Dad's not getting any younger." Lucas frowned. Protecting from what exactly? David sighed as if he were tired of explaining logic to people who didn't understand. "Look, houses like this need upkeep, insurance, taxes. If Dad passes, it could get complicated with probate. This way it's streamlined." I stepped closer. "You think I don't know how my own property works?" He lifted the papers toward me. "You don't need to be upset. It's legal. I have the notarized forms, the signatures, the fingerprint verification. Everything's above board." Emma put the dish down. "Wait. Fingerprints. You took Dad's fingerprints when he was in the hospital." David's tone hardened. He couldn't hold a pen. The nurse suggested it. I handled it for him. The room fell silent. Sophie stopped playing. Even the fire seemed to shrink. "You used my hand," I said slowly, "when I was recovering from heart surgery." David looked away for the first time. "It's not like that." Lucas stepped in between us. "What is it like then?" "Because it sounds a lot like you tricked him." David's voice rose. "Don't be dramatic, Luke. I did what any responsible son would do." I shook my head, my hands trembling. "Responsible?" You took the home your mother and I built. He met my eyes sharp now. Mom would have wanted it secure. Don't you dare use her, I said louder than I intended. Emma reached out, whispering, Dad, please, but I couldn't stop. You think a piece of paper makes this yours, I said. You think numbers on a line can erase 40 years of promises? David clenched his jaw. You're overreacting. I did this for the family. You're too emotional to see that. I stared at him. This man I had raised, who once held my hand crossing the street. If you wanted to help, you could have asked. Instead, you went behind my back. Lucas leaned closer to the papers. What date was this signed? David hesitated, flipping through the top page. Last March. Emma's face went pale. Last March. That's the week Dad was in the ICU. David shrugged again, avoiding her gaze. He was awake. He signed. Asked the hospital. Lucas reached for the document. Let me see. David held it back. No, it's private. Private, Lucas snapped. You just announced it at Thanksgiving dinner. The two of them stared each other down. I looked at the papers, thick, crisp, official, my name printed neatly on the line next to his, my signature below it. It looked like my writing, my hand, my name. But I had no memory of signing it. None. A strange fear crept up my spine. I tried to remember that week, the hospital lights, the beeping machines, the nurses with soft voices. Could I have signed something without knowing? Could he be right, David? I said quietly. Why didn't you tell me before today? He smiled thinly. Because I knew you'd react like this. You're not thinking rationally. Emma stepped closer. You forged it, didn't you? He glared at her. Careful, Emma. Accusing someone of forgery is a crime. She folded her arms. So is taking advantage of an elderly parent. Enough, he shouted. Sophie gasped, clutching her doll. Lucas immediately knelt beside her. Hey, it's okay, he whispered. David rubbed his temples. This is ridiculous. The paperwork is legal. You can call anyone you want, the notary, the bank, whoever. I swallowed hard. Then we will. Emma pulled out her phone. I'll call Mom's old lawyer, Karen. She'll know what to do. David laughed once, short and bitter. Oh, of course, the family savior. But no one laughed with him. The air in the room grew heavy. Sophie crawled into Lucas's lap. Emma stepped into the hallway, already dialing. I just stood there, staring at the papers on the table. My fingers itched to tear them apart, to burn them in the fireplace where Linda used to hang stockings for the kids. But I didn't move. Lucas came beside me. We'll figure it out, Dad. Don't let him get to you. I nodded, though I barely heard him. My mind felt foggy, disoriented, the kind of confusion that makes you question your own memory. I whispered, mostly to myself, I don't even know if I can trust my own mind anymore. The fire popped. Somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked. I thought it was the house settling, but deep down I knew better. It was the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. When everyone finally drifted to their rooms, I stayed behind. The fire had burned low, nothing left but glowing embers. I stared at the papers still sitting on the table, afraid to touch them again. It felt like if I did, they'd swallow me whole, and the house with me. For 40 years, this place had always felt alive. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of Linda's perfume that still lingered in the hallway. But now the air felt strange, almost foreign, as if the walls themselves were questioning who really owned them. I ran my hand over the table. It was smooth, warm from the fire. My fingers brushed the edge of the deed. My name, his name, both printed side by side. It didn't feel like father and son anymore. It looked like two strangers sharing a line in ink. From the hallway, I could hear Emma's voice, low, serious. She was still on the phone. Karen, it's Emma Wallace, she said softly. I'm sorry to call on Thanksgiving, but something's wrong. My brother says Dad signed a property transfer last year. A pause. Yes, the Wallace residence. I couldn't hear what Karen said, but Emma's tone changed. The week of March 12th. He was in surgery then. You're sure? Okay. Could you check if anything was filed under that date? Another pause. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Thank you. Please call me as soon as you find anything. When she hung up, she caught me standing in the doorway. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I just nodded and she nodded back, the quiet kind of agreement that comes when both people know something is deeply, terribly wrong. The next morning, the house felt heavier, as if it remembered everything we had said the night before. No one spoke much. Even the clock on the mantel ticked more quietly, as though afraid to break the silence. Emma made coffee, her eyes tired and red. Lucas sat near the window, scrolling through his phone, pretending to read the news. Sophie played with her doll, whispering to it like she was trying to make the world normal again. Then the phone rang. Emma answered. "Hello, yes." "Karen, thank you for calling back." She stepped into the hall, voice low but firm. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught the ones that mattered. "Filed under Dad's name, March 12th. That's the week of the surgery. Yes, send it to my email. Thank you." When she returned, she didn't look at anyone. She just set her phone down and said softly, "Karen confirmed it. The filing was backdated. It's not valid." David, who had just come downstairs, froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" Emma met his eyes. "It means you forged it." He let out a short laugh. "You're insane. Karen's been out of the game for years." Lucas stood. "She's still a lawyer, David, and she remembers Mom. She knows Mom never changed the deed." David's jaw tightened. "You think I'd risk my career for a stupid house?" I looked up from my chair. "You already did." He turned to me. "You think I'm the villain, don't you? The selfish son who only cares about money." I didn't answer. Sometimes silence hurts more than words. He reached into his briefcase. "Fine. If you won't believe me, maybe you'll believe Mom." From inside, he pulled out another folder thinner. Older, the edges yellowed. He opened it and laid it on the table like a weapon. "This," he said, "is Mom's will. The new one. She left this house to me." Emma gasped. "That's impossible." "She wrote it after her diagnosis," he said confidently. "I found it in her personal files. She wanted the house to stay with the one who could manage it responsibly. Her words, not mine." I stood up slowly. "Your mother never believed in favorites, and she would never use the word responsibly about love." David smirked. "You don't know everything she thought, Dad. Maybe she just didn't want you to carry the burden forever." I looked down at the signature. It was Linda's name, or at least it tried to be. The loops in the letters were uneven, the pen pressure wrong. She always signed her L with a flourish. This one was stiff, mechanical. Lucas leaned closer, took a photo with his phone. "That's not her handwriting." David's voice rose. "You're not an expert." "No," Lucas said calmly, "but I remember how Mom signed my report cards." Emma scrolled through her phone, opened an old family photo. "Look here, her signature on the back of the picture. It doesn't match." David slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. You people act like I'm some criminal." "You forged our mother's name," I said quietly. He turned toward me, eyes blazing. "You never trusted me. You never believed I could handle anything without your supervision." I took a step back. "Trust has to be earned, not taken." He laughed bitterly. "Earned. You mean like Lucas, the saint, or Emma, the perfect daughter?" "Stop it," Emma said, tears brimming. "You're breaking what's left of this family." "Breaking," he shouted. "It's been broken for years." The sound echoed off the walls. Sophie jumped, her doll slipping from her hands. She began to cry. Lucas moved quickly, putting his arm around her. "It's okay, sweetheart." I stared at David, at the man my son had become. "If you wanted the house, you could have just waited. I would have left it to all of you." "That's the problem," he snapped. "You would have split it, and then it would just rot." "You don't understand value, Dad." "Value," I whispered. "You think a home's value can be measured in dollars?" His expression softened for half a second, then hardened again. "You're stuck in the past. Someone has to think about the future." Emma's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, then looked at him coldly. Karen just confirmed something else. Mom revoked her old will the year before she died. There's no valid new one on record. David blinked. "That's impossible. She even sent me the document, Mom's handwriting, dated, notarized," Emma said, showing the screen. "It says, all previous versions void." He stared at her phone, his voice cracking. She must have been confused." "No," I said quietly. She wasn't. Silence hung heavy. The only sound was the fire popping behind us. David sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "You all think I'm the bad guy, but I was just trying to secure our future. You're going to thank me someday." I looked at him and saw something I hadn't seen before, fear. Not of losing money, but of losing control. Before anyone could speak, Sophie stood up. Her small voice broke the silence. "Grandpa." I turned. "Yes, honey, Grandma used to hide things in her Bible, right?" I nodded slowly. She did. I think I know where she put the real answer, and before we could stop her, she ran upstairs. Lucas followed halfway, calling after her, but she was quick. The sound of her footsteps echoed across the old floorboards. David scoffed. "She's just a kid. You're seriously letting a 10-year-old solve your problems." Emma shot him a glare that could have cut glass. At least she's looking for truth. For a moment, no one moved. Then we heard a drawer open upstairs, the sound of paper rustling. Sophie's voice floated down. "I found it." We all looked up toward the staircase. She came down slowly, holding Linda's old Bible against her chest. It was thick, worn, the leather faded to a soft brown. A single yellowed envelope peeked out from between the pages. Her hands trembled as she walked to me. "Grandpa," she said, "this was in Grandma's Bible." David rolled his eyes. Probably another old church donation receipt. But when Sophie opened the envelope, the room went silent. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, creased and fragile. She unfolded it carefully, the way a child handles something sacred. Her lips quivered as she began to read. "Frank, this house is your heart. Keep it until it stops beating." My breath caught. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't let anyone turn our home into numbers and contracts. It's where our love still lives. Promise me again that you'll stay." Her voice wavered, then stopped. She looked up at me, eyes shining. "That's all it says," she whispered. No one spoke. Emma put a hand over her mouth. "That's Mom's handwriting." Lucas nodded, tears in his eyes. No doubt about it. I reached for the letter, my fingers trembling as I touched the paper. Her handwriting, the gentle loops, the ink faded in spots where her hand must have paused. It felt alive, like she had written it yesterday. David's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I looked around the table at my children, at my granddaughter clutching the Bible to her chest, and I felt something shift in the room. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt like it was breathing again. I read the letter again under my breath. "Keep it until it stops beating." And for a moment, I could almost hear her voice beside me, soft and steady. "You kept your promise, Frank." After Sophie finished reading the letter, no one moved. The only sound left in the room was the soft crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock. I sat there staring at the paper in her little hands, the same paper Linda must have held all those years ago. David stared at the floor. Lucas kept one arm around Sophie. Emma wiped her eyes. And me, I just sat there trying to breathe. Eventually, everyone drifted away one by one. The room emptied. The fire burned down to quiet embers. I stayed. I took the letter from the table and held it up to the light. The handwriting wavered with the flicker of the flame, and for a moment it felt like she was here again, sitting across from me, smiling the way she did when she caught me trying to fix things that didn't need fixing. She had always been the calm one, the voice that softened every edge I had. I could almost hear her whisper, "You can stop fighting now, Frank. The house already knows who it belongs to." I sank into her chair by the window. It still creaked the same way. Outside, the late November wind shook the bare branches against the glass. Linda used to say the trees sounded lonely in winter, like old souls trying to remember spring. I unfolded the letter again, tracing the words with my thumb. "Keep it until it stops beating." That line hit me harder than I expected, because lately my heart had been slowing, and maybe deep down I'd been waiting for permission to let go, to rest. But she hadn't written those words as a goodbye. She'd written them as a reminder. Linda always believed in the quiet kind of love, the one that doesn't fade when the world stops clapping. When we were young, she'd tell me, if love isn't spoken, it dies quietly. And maybe I didn't speak it enough. Maybe I thought working hard, paying bills, keeping the roof steady was enough to prove love. But sitting there with her words in my hand, I realized silence can build walls just as easily as hammers can. Maybe I'd built too many, not just between me and my wife, but between me and my son. David hadn't always been like this. When he was little, he used to follow me on my mail route wearing a cap too big for his head. He'd race me to the next house, laughing every time. I used to think I was teaching him responsibility. But maybe I was teaching him distance, that work mattered more than words, that worth was something you earned, not something you were given. And now he'd built his own walls, taller, colder, lined with contracts and numbers. Maybe the apple didn't fall far from the tree after all. I closed my eyes and let the thought sting. "I'm sorry, Linda," I whispered. I tried to raise them right. A floorboard creaked. Lucas stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one and sat down beside me without a word. We just watched the light fade through the window, the orange glow turning to blue. He spoke softly. "Karen emailed the official report. The will's invalid dad. Legally, David's claim is dead." I nodded slowly. "I figured." He hesitated. "What will you do?" I looked at the fire. "I don't know yet, but I don't want to lose him. He's still my son." Lucas sighed. "You've got more patience than I ever could." I smiled faintly. Patience or guilt, sometimes they sound the same. He chuckled quietly, and for the first time that night, the air between us felt light again. When he left, Emma came in. She sat on the floor beside my chair like she used to as a kid. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "I should have stopped him before it went this far." "It's not your fault," I told her. "Sometimes love skips a generation before it finds its way back." She rested her head on my knee and nodded, silent tears falling. I brushed her hair gently, the same way Linda used to. After she went upstairs, the house grew still again. Then Sophie appeared holding a blanket. "Grandpa," she whispered, "you'll get cold." She draped it over my shoulders, then sat beside me, small and serious. "Grandma would be proud of you," she said. I smiled, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You think so?" She nodded. "Because you kept your promise." She leaned against me, her tiny heartbeat steady against my arm. For a moment, everything felt right again. Not fixed, not perfect, but right. When she went to bed, I stayed up staring at the letter again. The ink had faded, but the meaning hadn't. Love doesn't fade. It changes its voice from laughter to silence, from words to echoes. The house creaked again, a soft, familiar sigh. And in the quiet, I heard her voice, not like a ghost, but like memory breathing. "You did good, Frank. You kept us together." I closed my eyes. Let the words settle. Maybe that was what this house had been trying to tell me all along, that it wasn't the walls keeping me here. It was her. I looked toward the stairs where my family slept, my daughter, my son who'd lost his way, my granddaughter who'd found our hope again. Maybe love doesn't always heal the way we want it to, but it still reaches through the cracks. I folded the letter one last time and slipped it into my shirt pocket. It felt warm against my chest, right over the place it talked about. Outside, the wind softened. A single leaf brushed the window, clinging for a second before drifting away. I smiled. "Good night, Linda." Voice over. I thought I'd lost her. But maybe she never left. Maybe love just changes its voice. Don't go yet. Because what happened next, when I decided to face my son, changed everything. The morning came quiet, softer than usual. For the first time in days, the house didn't feel angry, just tired. The light slipped through the curtains in gentle ribbons, landing on the same oak table that had seen everything, the laughter, the shouting, the truth. I poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, one for me, one for her. I set both on the table, then laid Linda's letter beside them. The words still glimmered faintly in the morning light. "Keep it until it stops beating." I whispered to myself, maybe that's what forgiveness means, not forgetting what they did, but remembering who they still are. Outside, the wind rattled the dry leaves along the porch. I knew David hadn't left. His car was still parked out front. The thought of another confrontation made my chest tighten, but there was something heavier than pride holding me in place, a need to finish what was broken. I stepped outside. David was sitting on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. His tie was gone, his sleeves rolled up. For the first time in years, he looked small. Not the confident businessman who filled every room, but a lost boy who didn't know how to get home. I stood beside him for a long while before speaking. "You couldn't sleep either." He shook his head. "Didn't seem right to." I nodded, sitting down beside him. The wood groaned under our weight. "I didn't come out here to fight," I said. "Good," he muttered, "because I'm done fighting." We sat in silence for a few seconds that felt like minutes. The wind carried the faint smell of coffee and smoke. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once, then stopped. Finally he spoke. "You were right about the deed, about the will. Karen called me this morning. She left a message. I stayed quiet." He exhaled. "It's all invalid. Everything I did means nothing." I looked at him. "It never meant nothing, David. It just meant something different than you thought." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You were trying to take control before chaos," I said. "That's what you called it last night. You thought you were saving this family. But control isn't love. It's fear wearing a suit." He turned his head, eyes glistening. "You think I did this out of love? I think you did it out of loneliness." He laughed once bitterly. "Loneliness? You have no idea what that's like." I let out a long breath. "Don't I?" He looked at me. Really looked for the first time in years. I pointed toward the window. "Every morning I pour 2 cups of coffee. One goes cold. Every night I still turn off the light in the bedroom we built. You don't get to tell me what loneliness feels like, son." He stared at the ground, his voice breaking. "Then why did you shut us out? You never called. You never asked how I was doing. I was trying to build something and you made me feel like nothing I did mattered." That one hit deep, because he was right, at least partly. I rubbed my hands together. "I guess I thought you didn't need me anymore. You had your business, your family. I didn't want to get in the way." He swallowed hard. "And I thought if I could take care of the house, maybe I could prove I still mattered to you." I turned toward him. "You don't have to prove that, David. You always mattered, even when I didn't say it." He looked away, blinking fast. "I messed everything up." I smiled faintly. "That's a family tradition." He laughed, the sound shaky and wet. "You really think Mom would forgive me?" I nodded. She already did. That's what this house is, her forgiveness made of wood and time. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the porch. "I wanted it so bad, the security, the control, but it doesn't feel like winning anymore." "Because it wasn't supposed to," I said. "A home isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn every day you love your family." The words hung in the air like they belonged there. He wiped his face, silent for a long moment. Then he whispered, "I just wanted to feel seen, Dad." I nodded slowly. "Then look at me now." He did. For the first time, we didn't see enemies or mistakes or paperwork. Just father and son, broken in different ways, sitting on the same step. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out Linda's letter, and unfolded it carefully. I placed it between us on the porch railing. "Your mother's words belong to all of us," I said. He hesitated, then reached out, not to take it, just to touch the edge of the paper with his fingertips. The sun had risen fully now. Warm light spilled across the porch, across the letter, across our hands. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. After a while, I stood up and looked toward the door. "Coffee's getting cold." He smiled faintly. "You still make it the same way, half sugar, no cream." He chuckled. "Guess some things don't change." I nodded. Some shouldn't. We walked back inside together. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt full, like it had taken a deep breath after holding it too long. I set the letter back on the table next to the 2 cups, one still full, the other untouched. David stood behind me. "I'll make things right, Dad. I'll call the lawyer, withdraw everything." "I swear," I turned to him. "You don't have to swear. Just keep your heart honest. That's the only contract that matters." He nodded. We stood there in the morning quiet. The house seemed to settle around us, the floors creaking softly, the air warm again. I walked to the window, opened it just a bit, letting in the breeze. "The door will stay open," I said quietly, "just like your mother wanted." David looked at me, eyes glassy. "Thank you." I didn't answer. I just smiled. The wind caught the corner of Linda's letter, lifting it slightly, making the paper flutter like a heartbeat. And in that soft sound, paper, air, sunlight, I heard her voice again. Not words this time, just presence. Some promises never end. They just change hands. The room had grown quiet after the storm, but silence never meant safety in this family. Dad sat slumped at the head of the table, his breathing uneven, while Emma gathered the scattered papers David had thrown down in frustration. She froze. "Wait, this isn't complete." I looked over her shoulder. One page was jagged, torn as if ripped from the bottom. Half the signatures were missing. Emma's voice shook. "Where's the rest?" David's smirk returned too quick, too sharp. Maybe it got lost. Maybe Dad never signed all of it. Melissa's eyes darted toward his jacket pocket just for a second. "I caught it," she hissed David under her breath, but it was too late. Emma slammed the table. "You hid it. You tore it yourself." David stood towering, his voice rising. "Watch your mouth. You don't know what you're accusing me of." Dad struggled to rise, leaning on the chair. His voice cracked but carried weight. "David, where is the page?" For a moment David faltered. His jaw tightened, then he laughed hollow and cruel. "You want the truth? The truth is, maybe it's better if no one ever sees that page." Melissa grabbed his arm. "Stop talking." Emma's fists curled at her side. "Do you hear yourself? You've already betrayed him once and now you're doubling down," David barked back. "Betrayal. This is survival. He's weak. He doesn't know how to handle what he's got. Someone has to take control before it all collapses." The chandelier flickered as if the house itself shuddered at his words. I stepped forward, voice trembling. "You think stealing a signature makes you stronger? It makes you smaller than you've ever been." Sophie, who had been quiet until now, whispered from the corner, "Uncle David, why are you lying?" The innocence in her voice cut sharper than any of our accusations. David's face darkened. He turned toward the door, clutching his jacket tighter. Melissa's voice wavered. "We should go," Emma shouted after them. "You don't get to walk away. Bring that page back." But David didn't stop. The door slammed, rattling the frames on the wall. The rest of us stood in stunned silence. Dad's hand shook as he reached for the incomplete will, eyes wet with both rage and grief. Emma placed her hand over his. "We'll fight this, Dad. Even if it tears us apart, we'll fight it." I stared at the torn edge of the paper, jagged like a wound that wouldn't heal. Somewhere out there, David still held the missing piece, and with it, the power to twist our family's fate one more time. And as I looked at the shadows pooling across the room, one thought consumed me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If it were your family, if your brother tore the last page of your father's will and walked out, what would you do? Would you forgive and hope he returns it? Or would you fight until every secret is dragged into the light? Share your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, forgiveness may heal, but betrayal always echoes louder. Thank you for watching.